It's a nice Sunday morning to all of you. Thank you. Thank you. I grew up in the Himalayan forests, and for me, it was natural to recognize that we are part of nature. And every time I read about the illusion and the false assumption that we are somehow outside nature and we are masters and owners and controllers, I realize that that illusion is at the heart of both the threat to the planet and our health. Everything we do to the earth, we are doing to ourselves because we are part of the earth. We are not separate from her, we are not outside her. Every process that works for a healthy planet works for healthy people. And of course, you could go into ancient thinking. In India, we think of the 5 elements, the Panch Mahabhuta, the earth, the water, the fire, the air, and most interestingly, space. Because we forget that the configuration in space changes properties. That mad cow disease epidemic of the United Kingdom, eventually when they did the work on what was causing that spread of infection, it wasn't a virus and it wasn't a bacteria. It was a self-infective agent, and all it was a distorted protein. Its chemical constitution was exactly the same, but it was now distorted in its structure, in its space orientation. It was given the name prion, it was given a Nobel, the discovery was given a Nobel Prize. Space matters. Space matters to those poor animals who are in factory farms. Space matters in terms of how we are stealing the ecological space of other species which nourish us. We have an ancient Veda called the Upanishad called the Isho Upanishad, which says, this universe is for all beings. Enjoy her gifts without greed, because you cannot take other people's share and other species' share. And then it goes on to say, taking more than your share is theft. It's theft from other species, theft from other people, and theft from future generations. And that's where we are, where the future generations are now waking up and saying, you can't steal our future. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change met, and the COP of the Climate Treaty met in Poland in December. And all of these young children, 10 years old, 15 years old, were sending messages. There was one beautiful one from across the world. It really touched me. It was just before Christmas, and it said, all I want for Christmas. And here were these children speaking from around the world of what's going wrong. Some were talking climate change, some were talking species extinction, some were talking hunger. And at the end of it, each of them said what they want. Said, all I want is a future. All I want is a future. Now, how could humanity have reached a stage where the future generations whom we are supposed to be taking care of are telling us, all I want is a future? My civilization and the indigenous cultures of this land always talked about the 7th generation. That we must step so lightly on the earth that 7 generations to come benefit from our step. And if 7 generations to come are harmed, don't take that step. That in contemporary science is called the precautionary principle, enshrined in international law. And it's the violation of both the precautionary principle, the violation of the rights of future generations, of other species and other human beings that has also led to the disease epidemic, the chronic disease epidemic. Now my work, my life's journey started out with this very beautiful movement. I was going off to Canada to do my PhD. And before leaving for Canada, I wanted to visit my favorite mountain spot and carry it with me. And I was going to do this trek, and the forest was gone and had been converted into an apple orchard. And the stream that came out from that oak forest was a trickle. I had to be able to swim in it, and now it was just till my ankles. And for the first time, I realized in the early 70s, we can harm nature. And I'm sitting at this tea shop, they're called chai dhabas, all along India's roads. Nice hot cup of chai. And I talked about how in such a short time, this stream had disappeared and the forest had gone. And this man says, oh, but now there's hope because Chipko has started. So I asked him more, and Chipko means to hug. The women of the high mountains had come out to say, you're not going to cut these trees. We're going to hug them, you'll have to kill us before you kill the trees, because these trees and forests are our mothers. From there comes soil and water and pure air. Eventually, when there were floods, the government woke up to say, yeah. Forests and rivers have something to do with each other. They are not just timber mines. And now with climate change, they're waking up to the fact that we learned as little children that when we exhale carbon dioxide, it's the trees and the forests and the plants that convert it to oxygen and give us back our life-giving air. Interesting thing is, the tweet is an interesting phenomenon for you particularly because you've been governed by it. If you don't know what the tweet is, it's the silly little limited letters that you can put. So my colleagues insisted that I start tweeting. Now initially, I would put my best idea of the day, and they said it's not for philosophy. It's for comments. And I've been censored a lot, and my tweets have been stuck. My websites come down, my emails come down, but that's part of life. I'm waiting for the day F5G never happens. And I have a very minimal relationship with all of this new, I call it digital slavery. Because if it's stealing my time and my mind, of course it's slavery. And we have witnessed in India how it was used to steal the money of the biggest economy of the world, an economy measured not in terms of the money that gets transacted, but the real wealth of people. It was literally stolen 2 years ago to force digitalization. To force digitalization. It was called demonetization. It's the big debate in Indian politics even now. If you look at just two central figures, 75% of all damage to the planet is coming from the industrial food system. 75%. I think 3 years ago, there was a big expo in Milan, the Milan Expo. And the theme of this expo, because it was in Milan, was how to feed the world, because the Italians are passionate about food. And they made me an ambassador, and I was asked to write a book on who feeds the world. So I did a book called Who Really Feeds the World, because there's feeding the world in propaganda, and there's feeding the world with real healthy stuff. And when I was putting together both our research in India, through the Research Foundation for Science, Technology and Ecology, and the United Nations research, whether it be of the FAO or the United Nations Environment Programme or the United Nations Development Programme, all of it was pointing to the 75% destruction of the planet. In terms of climate change, the greenhouse gases are up to 50% from an industrial food system. And the figures are there in the UN FCC. In the production itself of industrial food with fossil fuel intensive farming and chemicals derived from fossil fuels like synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, which are made, interestingly, by blasting fossil fuels at very high temperature to fix atmospheric nitrogen. And for 1 kilogram of synthetic fertilizer, you use 2 liters of diesel. But it isn't just that you're using fossil fuels and that's contributing to climate change. Synthetic fertilizers emit a gas, nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more damaging to the climate system than carbon dioxide. And it's been missing in the climate debate. I just got a letter from Germany where young people are saying, we've got to free the soil of these synthetic fertilizers. And they're interested in addressing climate change. And they've woken up to the fact that you can't just talk carbon. And you definitely cannot equate living carbon with dead carbon. Dead carbon is the carbon of the plants and the sea life that the earth buried deep within herself and fossilized into what is fossil fuels. The gas, the oil, and I think the fact that the earth put it all under the soil deep down, basically she was saying, hands off, keep it there, keep it in the ground. And it's not that we didn't know it's there, because there's histories of First Nations using tiny bits for lighting, of the Burmese. The Burma shell was one among the first. The Burmese used to use it for lighting, but a little bit. And then we created Standard Oil, which had to be broken up later for antitrust. And oil was pushed everywhere. Oil was pushed everywhere, including in synthetic fertilizers. There were partnerships between IG Farben, the group of companies, the cartel that was responsible for all the human rights violations in Hitler's Germany, and Standard Oil. There was a company called Standard IG Farben. The money used to move. It was interesting. It used to move for weapons to fight each other, and then it used to move for the foundations of the tools that then became the foundations of industrial agriculture. And in those days, they used to say, we are now going to make bread from air, because the technology of blasting fossil fuels at high temperature fixed nitrogen was originally a technology for making explosives and ammunition. Later they said, oh, we can use it for fertilizer. And that's why it's not an accident that so many of the bombings are fertilizer bombs. The Oslo bombings, that young man was collecting fertilizer and blew up the government offices. Afghanistan, I was giving a talk once, and it was a security meeting. And there was a high-level security person from the US. For the first time, I realized that we've created the problem for ourselves in Afghanistan, because when we were trying to get the Afghans off the Soviets, we started to give huge amounts of urea as gifts. So every hut has sacks of fertilizer. And now they're making fertilizer bombs. That's where the material is coming from. So the idea was, we won't need soil. We'll make bread from air. That was the kind of arrogance. But not only is it messing up the climate, the water in which the nitrogen fertilizer mixes is killing all life in water. And if you look in all the oceans, as the fertilizer runoff moves, there are dead zones being created, and they're growing by the day, where no life can exist in the oceans. They're literally called dead zones by the United Nations. So 11 to 15% of greenhouse gases come from industrial production, fossil fuel use, nitrogen fertilizer use, and the nitrogen planetary boundary is the most severely ruptured boundary so far. And the third source is methane. Animals in factory farms emit methane because of the food they're fed. They're fed grain, not grass. Basically, herbivores are called herbivores because they live on grass. They live on a plant-based diet. And I've had these huge debates because FAO produced a report, The Long Shadow of Livestock. I said, but our livestock, our cow is a sacred cow. And she's not emitting methane. She's giving us the most beautiful blessings in her urine and her cow dung. We worship the cow dung in a festival around Diwali. Gobar Dhan Puja. Gobar is cow dung. Gobar Dhan is the wealth in the cow dung. Puja is a prayer. And they asked me, how do you know that they don't emit methane? I said, simple, methane stinks. I grew up in my mother's cow. My research foundation is in my mother's former cow shed. And the cows never stank. There was no methane. We didn't have food waste of the scales we have developed. 2%, 2 to 4% of the greenhouse gases, most of it methane, come from food waste. You just go past a waste garbage dump. 50% of the food we grow is wasted in the industrial system. The first reason it's wasted is they've celebrated uniformity as quality of safety. And I have in my country, as they tried to bring such laws on hygiene and sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And I remember the first draft, we had a good law on prevention of food adulteration. You can't add to food something that doesn't belong to food and should not be eaten. And we were fighting Coca-Cola because it adds all kinds of stuff that are inedible to Coca-Cola, including phosphoric acid and antifreeze that's put in cars for temperatures like this. So the thing is higher. And we found out what it has, and I'd helped women. The reason I was even working on this issue was women in South India had called me, I think it was 2020? No, 2020, 2010, or maybe even earlier. Time passes so fast. But they called me for Earth Day. I said, why is a village celebrating Earth Day fighting Coca-Cola? So I went out of inquisitiveness and learned then that for each bottle of Coke, there's 10 bottles of water destroyed. And the water of this very water-rich area had been mined. 1.5 million liters of water per day. And when I was leaving that evening, I asked my Lama who'd led the struggle, she's no more. I said, what do you want me to tell the people in Delhi? In those days, I could call a press conference and the press would come. These days, the press is owned by big money. It doesn't cover independent reports of any kind. So I asked her, what do you want me to say when I get back to Delhi? She said, tell them when they drink Coca-Cola, they drink the blood of my people. I've never, ever been able to even look at a Kinley bottle. I mean, that brownish liquid to me was disgusting from the beginning. And we've just lost a former industries minister, George Fernandez, a dear, dear friend, who founded with me the movement for India's freedom in the period of globalization. He just passed away. But in 1977, he had thrown Coca-Cola out for financial corruption. But they came back through globalization. And then the women of Plachimada threw them out. So when this movement was growing, we started a campaign to establish Coke and Pepsi-free zones everywhere. 4,000 schools joined. We got young people to talk to their grandmothers. What did we drink in summer? We brought back all the indigenous fruit drinks that were part of our culture. We have a little book. The latest edition is called Biodiversity in a Glass. And 4,000 schools went Coke Pepsi free. In our organic cafe in Delhi, in the Delhi heart, you'll still see a big poster, Coke Pepsi free zone. So when people want a Kinley bottle, we say, sorry, not available. And of course, there's this constant attempt to make it look like it's primitive to drink your grandmother's drinks. And I think only grandmother's food should be the future. There should be no other food around. But now, even the airlines are copying. And they're selling these fruit drinks. The panna, this beautiful raw mango drink that is brilliant for avoiding heat stroke. And of course, my favorite, the fresh lime, nimbu pani. We used to serve it all the time. Disappeared. Now in some airlines they're serving nimbu pani, except that Coca-Cola is trying to make a fake drink, fresh lime. We're going to see a lot of fake fresh, a lot of fake fresh. I've just written a piece. If you go to the Seed Freedom website, you will find a piece I've written on how this new report is on eating right, is sustaining the non-sustainable model. And it turns out that there's a whole new coalition. They call themselves Fresh. It's a coalition between this totally new forum called Eat Forum in Stockholm and all the players who have destroyed the planet and destroyed our food and our health. BASF, Bayer, who now owns Monsanto. Monsanto's name doesn't show up in these places because Bayer is Monsanto. Cargill, the ones who's messed up the world's diets by dumping bad food with a $400 billion subsidy. That's the global agriculture subsidy that goes to Cargill. Danone, DuPont. I'm reading out the familiar names. Google, they're in your plate now. Kellogg's, Nestle, Olam, PepsiCo. They're trying to make the former PepsiCo chief, the World Bank chief now. Yeah. I mean, that's the latest we heard, that Ivanka's favorite candidate is Indra Nooyi, who was head of PepsiCo. Syngenta, Solvay, and Yara, the world's biggest synthetic chemical fertilizer company. They're going to bring you fresh. So that's why defending truth and real food is now a survival imperative. It's not a luxury of a few rich people. It's necessary for us all. But let me come back to the figures that add up to the 50% of climate change driven by industrial food systems. So we normally miss out a figure that I added when I wrote my book, Soil Not Oil, which is precisely on the subject. Land use change and deforestation is 15 to 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, why is land being lost to forests? In the Indonesian rainforest, it's palm oil expansion, and palm oil is in everything now. And in the Amazon, it is GM soya expansion. That's why it's no longer enough to just say plant-based. Plant-based soya, sprayed with glyphosate, Roundup Ready GMO soya that chopped down the Amazon, destroyed the lungs of the planet, doesn't do you good, and it doesn't do the planet good. The two are inseparable. And then in processing and transport and packaging and retail, it's 20%. India had no garbage 20 years ago. In villages, we served in leaves. The city, you went with a cloth bag. The women packed in recycled paper. They made it all illegal. Packaging was made a requirement. And I support women's group that do artisanal processing. And every few weeks we have the inspectors arrive and fining us because the women wrote by hand the word rupees. Because they don't have computers in the village. They don't have printers in the village. But they make the most delicious namkeen. When I was coming to the US, there was a new big installation at the Delhi airport by PepsiCo about how they're growing ecologically friendly. And one of the installation was the chips packet. You know, the chips come in aluminum packets. And on the package, they had put 78% plant-based. I said, now this miracle of PepsiCo, you know, they had the miracle of turning good enough food into terrible stuff, the chips that are spreading obesity. How did they do the miracle of making aluminum out of plants? Because basically for them, it's just imagining that people will walk through, believe this is true, and take the package and not feel guilty about being part of the garbage. And our Prime Minister has even launched a huge program called Swachh Bharat, Clean India. And I always say, till you stop the industry that creates bad food within the package and garbage in the package, is making us dump garbage within our bodies and dump garbage outside, and you give them tax concessions for 20 years, and you allow them to rip off the farmers. I'll give you the figures. I mentioned yesterday the BT cotton suicides. Last year, suicide started in the potato area. We don't have a potato area. We are not Peru. Peru grew potatoes. I mean, we grow potatoes, a little sabji, aloo ka parantha, it's wonderful. But we didn't grow it in miles and miles and miles. And the most fertile land of the world that the Ganges has created by depositing silt from the Himalaya over millennia, in that area there's potatoes being grown now. And last year the farmers were selling potatoes for 5 rupees for a bag of 50 kilos of potato. Now, 70 rupees makes $1. So divide 70, 5 rupees, can you imagine what it is? I think less than 5 pence, huh? For 50 kilograms. Now, Pepsi takes that potato that it got for 5 rupees for 50 kilograms and gives you 20 grams for 20 rupees. And also the aluminum package that they are now pretending is made of plants. Because I think you all have infected them with plant-based. They think it's so fashionable to say plant-based. So even aluminum now is becoming plant-based material. Renewable resources. The IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its recent report released for the Poland summit, has warned that we have exactly 12 years to make a transition. After that, things will be so catastrophic that making a change will not be possible. And whether it is the IPCC or the Biodiversity Convention or scientists around the world, they're talking about a decade window. The Biodiversity Convention is talking about the 6th mass extinction. Now, why are insects suddenly disappearing? 80% are gone. 80%. And among the insects are the pollinators, the butterflies and bees. Because you've created a whole body of chemicals whose only job is to kill. The war on bugs is in the design of industrial agriculture. Therefore, why are we surprised when bugs disappear? And we've made it look like every insect, including the wonderful pollinators that give us 1/3 of the food we eat, are bugs. You should be scared of. Get rid of them, kill them, exterminate. This logic of extermination that came from Hitler's concentration camps is every day in our farms and every day in our plates. Until we learn to turn that around and make the logic of the celebration of life, we will not be able to begin to start to heal the planet and our own bodies. Now, 75% of the bees are gone in chemically intensively farmed regions, and 90% of the monarch butterfly, because the monarch feeds on the plants that are killed by Roundup. So, of course, Monsanto gives a little money for a little patch to keep those plants alive, to keep the bees alive, whereas extermination carries on. On the Navdanya farm, where we save seeds and we protect biodiversity, we did not really start out thinking of ourselves as conservers of pollinators. But they came. We grew so much diversity, so many flowers, the food was abundant. We have 6 times more pollinators on the farm in Doon Valley than in the forest next door. And our research has shown that every 3rd spoonful we eat is not produced by us, it's produced by the pollinators. Because we shut off the pollination and the beans were 1/3 less. The production was 1/3 less. And of course, there is this terrible technological hubris that it doesn't matter. We'll always be able to solve every problem we've created with another technology. So if the technology of pesticides destroyed our pollinators, what are they looking for? Robot bees. Now we have 20,000 species of pollinators and of bees alone. And just for a coffee crop, 22 trillion pollinator visits are made to a flower. 22 trillion. All they've got with this machine is the ability that it can lift itself. And they're really thinking that gives them the right. This clumsy machine gives them the right to exterminate the pollinators that feed us. And I believe they have a right not only because they feed us, they have a right because they are. All beings have a right to be on this planet. And if the mechanical worldview, which started with the fossil fuel age, gets layered on the colonial worldview that declares that they are superior races and their job of civilizing is extermination, which is what they did to this land, 99% people gone. That's civilizing the barbarian through extermination. In a way, that crudeness of thought is coming back with the superior race idea all over. It's infecting every society. It's just that we are such a diverse planet that who will be the superior race where is a bit diverse. But superiority is uniform around the world. So 50% of the damage to the climate is coming from industrial agriculture, but most people don't even think of food as an element in climate change. Part of it was they moved to energy, because fossil fuel was energy. They said, okay, let's have alternative energy. Not remembering that the first energy is food. Food is energy. And for those of you with a little familiarity with Indian thinking, we don't just think in terms of energy, we think in terms of different forms of energy. There's the sattvic, which regenerates. The rajasic, that excites. The tamasic, that makes it heavy. And that's the reason good food rejuvenates you. But good food is also sattvic for the planet. And I think it's only when those concerned with eating the right way and those concerned with climate change start to put food and how we grow it as a missing piece, we won't be able to address the problem. That's what I've been doing. When I looked at the data, not because I was looking at the data for climate change. You know, I made a clear choice in '92 at the Convention on Biological Diversity, and I wrote the speeches of my ministers for the Earth Summit. But then I said, I'm going to give my time to the protection of life on Earth and biodiversity. And I'll save seats because it was so urgent, because, you know, the Monsanto lobbyists used to be in the corridors. And I said, these guys are evil. And so I'll put all my energy into biodiversity and seeds. And there are other friends who look at how many percentage increase is happening with the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Today, not only do we realize that 50% of the greenhouse gases come from an industrial food system that also gives us bad food, that is responsible for 75% of the chronic diseases, that when we shift to ecological agriculture and biodiversity-based systems, we are finding an answer to the climate change problem in two ways. Both by reducing the emissions, because if you're not destroying your small farms, you're not using heavy fossil fuel. When you're doing organic, you're not using synthetic chemical fertilizers. When you have symbiotic relationships between farming families and animals and trees and crops, you don't have the methane emissions. And when you don't have these long distance chains and uniformity, you don't have food waste. I mean, in India, we've never known food waste. What we don't eat, the cow will eat. And what the cow won't eat goes into the compost, as I've seen in this lovely bin you've been composting. So why should there be food waste? Everything is food. Everything is something else's food. That's what our Vedas tell us. And my ecological learning has taught me that the web of life is a food web. And food is the currency of life. We even say Annam Brahman. Food is an embodiment of the divine. Therefore, give it respect. Therefore, be thoughtful about how you grow it. And in the Taittiriya Upanishad, it says, the growing and giving of good food is the highest dharma. And the growing and giving of bad food is the highest adharma, the equivalent of sin. Food is at the heart of the right way to live on this planet. So when we do organic farming, we are literally taking the excess nitrogen out of the atmosphere and through the nitrogen fixing crops, putting it back in the soil. So you keep talking about plant-based proteins. The same plant-based proteins are nitrogen fixers. And they fix atmospheric nitrogen in a very non-violent Gandhian way, not the violent militarized way of making synthetic fertilizers. Every time photosynthesis happens, living carbon is being created. And carbon is not the problem. The dead carbon is the problem. That's why when they say decarbonize, Bill Gates keeps saying we have to decarbonize the planet. I said, Mr. Gates, you'll be totally dead if you're decarbonized, because we are living carbon. Our food is living carbon. The planet is living carbon. It's the dead carbon that's the problem. And we need more living carbon and zero dead carbon. So when every time there's a little leaf that's growing, it's doing photosynthesis, it's fixing the atmospheric carbon, putting it back into the soil where it belongs, pulling it out of the atmosphere where the excess doesn't have to build up. We have proven ways, both in nature as well as in 10,000 years of farming and the future, 10,000 years of good ecological farming and good ecological food production. We have ways to heal the broken carbon cycle and the broken nitrogen cycle that are at the root of climate change. Now, the interesting thing is when on the tweet, my one tweet that's getting blocked is when I explain the simple phenomena of how plants can heal the planetary destruction. There's a panic because they don't want you to know that you can work with nature to address these problems, because they want to have geoengineering to blast artificial volcanoes. They want geoengineering to pollute the atmosphere with chemicals, and they call it cooling the planet. And I've had debates with some of these brilliant scientists, many of them are Nobel laureates, and I say, but when you so-called cool the planet by putting a layer of pollution, you're doing exactly what the problem is, because the greenhouse gases are creating a layer of pollution, and that's why the problem. How do you expect that same pollution to now be a solution? But more importantly than that, when you've blocked out the sunshine, what on earth is going to happen to our agriculture, to our food, to our trees? Oh, I don't look at that. It's not in my project, and that's part of the problem. That science has become so reductionist and so fragmented and so much in tiny linear boxes that it doesn't see the relationships and doesn't take responsibility for them. I did physics inspired by Einstein, and for him, responsibility was a central piece of the creativity of science. That you could not separate the technical dimensions of using a tool and the ecological and social dimensions of the consequences of the use of that tool. That was all part of one action, and you were responsible for it. I remember President Bush had a favorite program that didn't go through then. He wanted to put reflectors in the sky to send the sunshine back. And I remember writing a piece at that time. I said, the sun is a blessing, not a problem. The problem is the pollution that's preventing the sun from coming here and the heat of the sun to escape again. So we have this disease of constantly naming life as the problem and the extinguishing of life as a solution to every problem we've created by harming life in the first place. If you move from the climate disaster to the soil disaster, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity has said that the degradation of land is the single biggest urgent issue because it is dislocating, dispossessing people, and they're refugees all over the world now. Now, but 3 years ago, it was the year of soil. I'm on an international commission on the future of food that was started by the president of the region of Tuscany, Claudio Martini, at that time. And this international commission meets every few years to address a key issue. And we produce a manifesto. We call it Manifesto for Fun. We're not writing a mass line, we're not expecting, we do it for clarity. We did a manifesto on the seed, on the food, on climate change, on the knowledge systems. When the 2008 Wall Street collapse happened, we did a manifesto on knowledge, because the crisis is a core crisis of knowledge. And in the year of soil, not only was it a year of soil, but it was the year where all these boats were crossing the Mediterranean and they were sinking. There's an island in Italy called Lampedusa then. Now the crisis has moved to Greece because more refugees are coming from Syria. We said, we've got to make sense of this explosion in the refugee crisis in the context of soil. And we had the former Secretary General of the UN Convention on Desertification. I don't think you even know about it because the New York Times won't cover this convention. There's a convention on land degradation and desertification. And Luke was part of this group of experts. And together we wrote, and we focused then on 2 cases of the link between the refugees and the soil. The first was Africa, where one of the biggest lakes, Lake Chad, had shrunk from 22,000 square kilometers to nothing. Why is the water gone? because 80% of the water from the rivers that feed this lake is being diverted for commercial commodity agriculture for international trade. So the lake's drying up. But there are people, 9 million people, who depend on the lake as fishermen, as pastoralists, as farmers. And as the water starts to shrink, conflicts start. I did a book for the United Nations called Ecology and the Politics of Survival on conflicts over natural resources, way back in the 80s. That so many conflicts that are named religious are actually conflicts over a damaged earth and trying to find your little bit of water, your little bit of land, your little bit of food. The Arab Spring, the UN recognized the Arab Spring was really about bread, because when they started to march, they were marching with bread. The vendor who killed himself in Tunisia was a vegetable vendor who was being made illegal to sell vegetables under these new safety norms. It was a bread revolution. So, of course, the conflict really was between different communities losing their livelihood. But because of the way Africa has been colonized, the pastoralists have stayed Islamic, and the settled agriculturists were converted to Christianity. So instead of seeing that it's two communities desperate over disappearing water, it was named a religious conflict. And Boko Haram and everything else came out of it. My book on the violence of the Green Revolution shows exactly this trajectory of conflicts in the Punjab in 1984. And take Syria, 2009, they'd had a very severe drought. Before that, they'd had the Green Revolution like India. And Green Revolution requires 10 times more water to grow the same amount of food. So they had mined all their groundwater. And the rain didn't come. 1 million peasants became refugees. Their livestock died. They moved to the cities. But the World Bank structural adjustment prevents governments from supporting farmers. You can subsidize agribusiness, but you can't support your farmers. So the government was not allowed to support the farmers. And then within 2 years, the arms started to flow. And the war of Syria, which is a war without end, who's fighting whom, nobody knows anymore. But half of Syria is refugees. Half of Syria. Fertile Crescent, where agriculture started. And if you start making a map of how many regions are being devastated, both directly by the attack on the earth and indirectly by attack on the economies that are sustained by the earth and the livelihoods, that map is the map of the world we are living in. And land and water crises that are created on the ground and are linked to the greenhouse gas emissions also create vulnerability. The same systems that contribute to climate change are more vulnerable to climate change. Our work in Navdanya has found that the more diverse your system, the more easily you can deal with a drought. The more organic matter in your soil, the more you can deal with water scarcity. 0.5% organic matter, that's all. 0.5% organic matter can contribute 80,000 liters to soil. You'll never have a drought. Because your soil becomes the reservoir. And what makes it a reservoir is the making of humus with the mycorrhizal fungi and the aggregation of soils. The soil therefore becomes like a sponge, holds the water. And then the rains might fail, but your soil will grow your crop. And just like in all other inputs, whether it's fertility or it's controlling pests with pesticides, with water we've forgotten that the soil is a source of water. And we're thinking irrigation is the only way we'll get water. And so in this country, you've mined the Olagala aquifer. In India, the land of Punjab, the land of 5 rivers, is today under a severe water crisis. And it said in 10 years' time they might have no water. And in fact, the problems of Punjab were water conflicts. 20 engineers had been killed for building a canal that would take the water out of Punjab to other states. It's often said the wars of the future will be around water. I say today's wars are also around water. I wrote a book on this called Water Wars, because so many of India's rivers are now sources of conflict, whether it be the Sutlej or the Kaveri or the Krishna or the Godavari. And when we have our national anthem, we think of all these rivers as our river goddesses. And because we violated them today, instead of nourishing us, they become the source of conflict. And of course, we are polluting them with water pollution from chemicals being a major source. Now, this polluting industrial farming that gives us 75% chronic diseases and also is destroying 75% of the life support of the planet and 50% of the climate balance, it gives us only a pathetic 30% of the food we eat, and that too is bad for our health. 30%. The small farms give us 70% of the food we eat, and this is FAO data, the Food and Agriculture Organization data. In fact, they say, this year they say 80%. Last year they were saying 70%. 70%, 80% of the food we eat comes from small farms that are only 20% of the land. Only 20% of the land. Now, if you take the 30% that's destroying 75% of the planet, and you enhance it through the force and the brute force with which it's being imposed, I deal with it daily in my country. All kinds of new tricks. The latest being, oh, you don't have to farm anymore, take 17 rupees a day. 17 rupees a day. That's 5 cents a day. And live in a world of privatized water, privatized electricity, privatized education, privatized health, and you don't grow your own food. This direct payment issue came out of agribusiness in this country at the beginning of the World Trade Organization discussions. It's now arriving in India. And Monsanto has said now they're going to be farming without farmers, with drones in the sky, spyware in the tractors, tractors that don't have drivers, driverless tractors. Everyone's going crazy about driverless tractors. We don't need tractors in the first place. So all of it, I mean, the three convergences, we should be having a convergence of human life and the rest of life on this planet. Our food and the food system and the food web. What we are getting a convergence of is the destructive technologies and their power. The destructive chemical technologies that became the biotechnologies and the control over seed. The destructive control over money that they now call fintech, just because 5G is part of it. They just put tech behind anything and expect us to sit back and say we won't ask a question. We won't resist. No, if you're threatening our freedom and our life, we will resist in the non-violent ways in which Gandhi taught us. That resisting brute force and the theft of our freedom is our duty for being on this earth. And the third that becomes part of it is the information technologies. They're working very hard in the World Trade Organization to have zero taxes. So Amazon anyway steals taxes, but now they want to legally have a right to pay no taxes. So here you have a regime that's taken 99% of the wealth of the people, concentrated it in the hands of few. They're integrating amongst themselves. There's no boundaries between them anymore. And they want to pay no taxes. This is the debate in your country. This is the debate in my country. I believe anything that harms the earth, anything that harms our health, anything that is against democracy should be taxed. Polluter pays. It's a law. The polluter should pay, including the 5G pollution. It's a different kind of pollution, but it is into electromagnetic pollution. And the mining of our minds. I mean, look at what Facebook did. It mined our data, sold it to Cambridge Analytica, which then sold it to the political system. And as is often said, the first artificial intelligence president you have in White House now. Because artificial intelligence put him there, not the people. And this convergence is part of what we have to deal with. In terms of soil, soil is our very being. We are the soil. And an ancient Veda says, in this handful of soil is your future. Take care of it, it will take care of you. Destroy it, it will destroy you. So the history of every civilization that has gone is a history of the destruction of soil. Every civilization. And the fact that India and China are still here is because we took care of the soil. We got up in the morning, before we put our foot down, we apologized to the earth. Before we put a plow, we apologized to the earth. The Atharva Veda, if you want to read it. It's a beautiful text. These are poetries to the earth. They're not religions. They are the divinity in the earth and in life. And that's why, for me, they are so inspiring. The idea that food is the beginning of the life process and is the circulation of the life process is exactly where our solutions to the threats to the planet and the threats to our health will come. Now, health begins in soil. It begins in soil because it's in the soil that we start producing nutrition and health. Now, just imagine, something is so wrong with an agriculture and food system where we imagine that what the soil needs is synthetic nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That's it, NPK. NPK, that's it. And every bit of it is then killing the soil. So we started to do organic farming. And we started to do organic farming because I didn't want non-violent farming. I didn't want our farming to be like war. I'd watched what it did to Punjab. We just completed a 20-year study. 20 years in our valley, Doon Valley. Different organic farms, including the Navdanya farm. So the chemical farms in Doon Valley have lost organic matter by 14%. Organic farms have increased organic matter between 29 to 99%, depending on the crops they're growing. The total nitrogen, we imagine when we pour urea onto the soil, we are increasing nitrogen content of soil. In the chemical farms, nitrogen has declined by 7 to 22%. We are losing nitrogen through nitrogen fertilizer. In the organic soils, we've increased it by 21 to 100%. By not applying urea, you're actually growing the nitrogen because the organisms are growing the nitrogen for you. Available phosphorus, up 63% in organic, 0 increase in chemical. Available potassium, minus 22 in chemical, where you're applying potassium, up 14 to 84% in organic. And, now they want to do bioengineering for zinc because there's a zinc deficiency. The zinc has gone down 37% in chemical. Chemical farming is a way of stealing our nutrients. It's gone up 14%. And I had a public health visitor from Australia, and when she saw this data, she said, I now understand why 50% of the teenagers who come to us and have depression, and we've traced that the depression is because of zinc deficiency. It's because of the way we are growing our food. Attention deficit. It's known to be because of magnesium deficiency. 70% decline in chemical, 14% increase in organic. Iron, 12% decline. And it's not just what you do to the soil, It's how you grow your biodiversity. When we grow biodiversity, and I said the yield per acre is just not enough of a measure, because all it's measuring is a commodity, its weight, not looking at its nutrition, and equating nutritionally empty, toxic food with nutritionally rich, healthy food. It's a very wrong measure. So I started to look at biodiversity as the outcome of agriculture. And we started to do biodiversity-based productivity, taking everything that a farm grows, because good farms grow biodiversity. Good farms grow pollinators. Good farms grow community. Good farms grow proud farmers. Those are outputs. Humans are not just labor, and labor is not just an input into the farming system. If you see, how do they say they've grown more food over these years through industrial farming? How do they say we are more productive? You know what the calculation is? It'll shock you. All they do is take labor as an input. The fewer people there are on the land, the more productive your agriculture. You might be producing less food, you might be producing worse food. But driving farmers out is your indicator of productivity. I was giving an annual talk in Goa for the Chief Minister of Goa, and there was a head of an IT business who had made some remarks before my talk. And of course, you know, the information technology business is thinking it's running the world. You know, they've become the new robber barons of the world. They are the new billionaires. And they really feel, why aren't we being treated like emperors? So he said we should have a separate queue where we don't do immigration anyway. Why should we have passports? We shouldn't stand with the riffraff in immigration queues. And we've created such growth in the world, and it's agriculture that's driving growth down. And therefore, we need to reduce the denominator. You know, when productivity is a ratio of output per unit input, input is the denominator. He basically was saying, in very mathematical ways, let's get rid of the farmers. And when I had to speak, I began with that. I said, you've contributed hugely, but you are an equal citizen to the smallest peasant of this country. They are not a denominator for your calculation. They are those who bring us food and health and freedom. We are not inputs. We are co-creators and co-producers with the farming system. So what we did a few years ago is we took 200 farms growing biodiversity organically and comparing them to chemical monoculture farms. Overall, we found 106% more copper, 61% more manganese, 243% more molybdenum, 64% more zinc, 72% more trace elements taken together. And very roughly, that is how protein per acre, carotene per acre. You don't need golden rice. They're going to push golden rice heavily. From 2000, oh, children are dying of blindness. We must put carotene into the rice. It's 7,000% less efficient in providing carotene than our lovely moringa, our mint, our coriander, our methi. 7,000% less. All we need is gardens everywhere with diversity. Gardens everywhere. We need to reclaim this earth from being a devastated planet where the chemical industry has declared war against people and the land. We need to turn this earth into a beautiful garden. And we have someone in the audience who was showing me how here in Long Island, he has created a garden. Because what the earth is asking for is our love. That's all she's asking for. Our love and our care. And the most efficient farming systems that give us far more nutrition, folic acid, energy, thiamine, trace elements, iron. You don't need 75% Indian women to be iron deficient. They are, because you're growing only rice and wheat and then polishing it and removing all the nutrients. And you're killing the capacity for people to garden their food. But it isn't just the care. As I mentioned, the pseudo-productivity is based on the idea of labor as an input, and the fewer the farmers, the more efficient your agriculture. And when the WTO globalization started, the agribusiness lobbies were there, and we had ministers who would say, oh, we need fewer farmers to be more efficient. And we did 2 calculations for them. The first calculation was, if you come, and they were saying we must become like America with 2% people on the land, 2% people. You have more people in jail than on the land. We should put everyone out of jail onto the land. And we worked a calculation, said given the kind of absorption in urban employment there is, if you're destroyed as a farmer, how many years will it take? It was more than 4 centuries. So quite clearly, no one's going to be waiting 4 centuries for a job. But more importantly than that is the fact that farms with more intensive inputs from people, from human beings, actually produce more. I want to show you some data that needs to be far more prevalent. These are graphs from the Food and Agriculture Organization. And they're on total output of food, not yield of a single commodity, which is very different. You can just grow a lot of rice or a lot of soya bean and nothing else. But total output is what matters, what the farm is growing. And the index here is the size. The smaller the farm, the more it's producing. That's a known scientific fact. Small farms produce more. Look at any indicators. And why do they produce more? Because they bring something the agribusiness cannot. They bring love and care. The tender, loving care, the TLC factor. And there is no factor more important than TLC in the food system. You say, Mama, our mama cooks so well because she brings tender, loving care into the food. And that care is what allows more production to happen. The more biodiverse intense your farm, the more biodiverse output it's producing. And our research is showing we could feed 2 Indias if we farmed with biodiverse intensity rather than chemical intensity and removing farmers from the land. 2 times India's population. This issue of scarcity, oh my God, 9 billion people? 9 billion we can feed like that if we grow real food. Because in any case, the biggest expansion right now of the commodities that are being grown, in the Green Revolution, it was rice and wheat and corn. Today, it is GMO corn and GMO soya. Is it being eaten by people? 90% goes for biofuel and animal feed. 90%. Only 10% is being used for feeding, which is why we have a hunger emergency. 1 billion people without food. And actually, the disease epidemic and hunger are 2 sides of the same coin of a malfunctioning food system that isn't designed to feed people. It's designed to maximize profits and maximize carelessness. If you see the advertisements, I remember we didn't have Roundup in India. It's still not approved. Monsanto is spreading it illegally. But in Bangalore, I saw a wall painting. And it had a woman's hands tied up in greens. And it said, liberate yourself, use Roundup. That working with plants is slavery. And the reason you have so much industrial food is I remember you used to have a lovely advertising image of Betty Crocker. Betty Crocker was to liberate us from our kitchens. And I'm sometimes taken to new buildings, especially where super rich finance people are living now. And the buildings have no kitchens. They have a TV and a microwave next to it. So you're making all this money, $1 million a month, and eating junk. We need new indicators of true well-being. I work with the government of Bhutan, and in Bhutan, they said we won't measure GDP, we'll measure happiness. So I helped them with the transition to organic. And they have created a happiness index. I think the food and sustainable agriculture ecological community should join hands to make a well-being index for all life on earth and all human beings. And what should be excluded? What should be banned? 5G. GMOs, toxic chemicals. All of that doesn't have a place at all. So, of course, we can grow more food without destroying the planet. In fact, we regenerate the planet in growing real food. And the reason is quite simply because we are a continuum with the earth. We are not separate. And all beings are a continuum. We created these very crazy hierarchies. Men superior to women, white superior to blacks, rich superior to poor, superior races. We declared nature as dead. We declared plants as vegetative. Now, the interesting thing is the roots of vegetable is, in Latin, is full of life. To be a vegetable is to be full of life. But we've changed the meaning. To vegetate means to be dead. In the hospital, so-and-so is on life support. They've turned into a vegetable. I'm writing a new dictionary. I'm writing a new dictionary of how every term was turned on its head to allow this 1% economy and the poison economy to explode. Crop Life is the name of the lobby group of the pesticide industry. Crop Life. Sanitary and phytosanitary measures are the name for shutting down all healthy and safe food. Women in England could not bring cakes to hospitals on Sundays. It was considered dangerous. Industrial food in packages was considered healthy and safe. In India, they tried to shut down all our edible oils, and we did the Sarson Satyagraha. I mentioned Gandhi's word for the force of truth, for fighting unjust brute law, which is also practiced by Thoreau, who doesn't come from very far from here. His Walden Pond is right here. And when he was being forced to pay the poll tax, he said, I will not pay, because my paying the poll tax means I'm supporting slavery. And he refused. He went to jail for a day. Gandhi practiced satyagraha throughout his life, first against apartheid in South Africa. He said, we are one humanity. We can't be divided by race. Against the compulsory planting of indigo, against the salt tax. When I started Navdanya, I started the seed satyagraha. I said, no matter what law you bring, our duty to the earth is to save our seeds. Our duty to future generations is to hand over seeds in the purity, integrity, beauty, diversity in which we receive them. Therefore, we will not obey your laws that come in the way of this higher duty to the earth and our fellow humanity. We've done the Sarson Satyagraha, where they tried to ban our local oils. They tried to ban Gandhi's cold press mill 2 years ago. And I was called and I did a satyagraha. And what was the criteria for shutting down Gandhi's heritage mill? Because it didn't have a lab and 2 chemists. Now, when something's hazardous, you want to measure the hazards. But when something's pure and you're cooking it yourself, that direct relationship is the verification. So I'm now working, like I'm requesting you to join a movement on doing a new index of well-being in the continuum of life on earth. I'm working on a new system of safety and quality in food with the women's movements of India. We are creating local groups because our local food is being shut down under these pseudo-hygiene measures. If it's not packaged, it can't be brought. We want to give to each other open, without the plastic, without the aluminium, with a lot of love to each other. And a guarantee that I have grown this with love and quality. And those who are eating it. I don't like the word consumer because the word consumption in the Middle Ages was the word for TB. You died of consumption, and we are dying of consumption, and we are killing the planet of our consumption. We're killing the planet of consumption, and we're killing the planet of convenience. 5G, fertilizers, pesticides. When I ask people, I said, why are you so addicted to constantly having your phone? I mean, you see how we are like zombies? We're sitting next to each other and like that. We've forgotten community. We've forgotten communion. We've forgotten neighborliness. We've forgotten family. We've forgotten earth family. So what I've been trying to do over the last 5 decades is cultivate earth democracy. That the ultimate democracy is the democracy of being alive and sharing this life with other life and being aware of the vibrance and the cooperation that it calls for. And I can see that no matter what it has been, it could be a river's life, it could be a forest life, it could be the life of our farms and our soil, it could be the seed, it could be our women's groups making the most delicious food. It is at the end of it about the democracy of life and the celebration of diversity as equality. We've been made to believe that uniformity is equality. But uniformity creates hierarchies. The measure of whiteness creates the inferiority of the black. The measure of maleness and patriarchy creates the domination over women. The measure of anthropocentrism creates the domination over the natural world. It's those dominations that we need to transcend now. And for me, there's a new book we've done, it's called Annam in India, and there's Acres Publications that works on sustainable agriculture. They've just brought this out in the US. It's called Food, Farming and Health. And it's the consolidation of all our work that interfaces our work on organic farming, biodiversity, soil, and health. And there are Ayurvedic doctors who've written chapters here. They're public health specialists who've contributed. So do look for it. And this book called Biodiversity, Agroecology and Regenerative Organic Agriculture will also be published this year by them. It's our 30 years of learning of how we can address every problem we face through protecting biodiversity, practicing agroecology, and promoting regenerative agriculture, whether it be the problem of the disappearance of species, whether it be the problem of the disappearance of water, the degradation of our soil, the destabilization of climate systems, the disease epidemic, the hunger and malnutrition, or the destruction of our farming families. 31 years of a lot of labor of love in there. But I want to conclude by the final connection between the planet and our health. The world is biodiversity, but we often forget that we are biodiversity. We are 90% non-human. Only 10% of us is human. And in our gut are the gut bacteria, 100,000 times more microbes in our gut than on people on the planet. And a specialist on the mind-gut relationship says, for decades, the mechanistic, militaristic disease model set the agenda for medical research. As long as you could fix the affected mechanical part, we thought the problem would be solved. There was no need to understand its ultimate cause. We were just beginning to realize that the gut, the microbes living in it, the gut microbiota, the microbiome, constitute one of the major components of these regulatory systems and the signaling molecules that they produce from their vast number of genes. The reason you need as much diversity in your food, you have to first grow it and eat it, is because the gut is an amazing intelligence system. It's actually being called the second brain, the enteronervous system. There's more neurological activity going on in the gut than in the brain. And the fact that so many neurological disorders are growing because of the food we eat is because of the connection to the gut. Specific molecules and phytochemicals found in herbs and spices activate specific taste receptors and trigger particular metabolic processes. Sweet receptors stimulate the absorption of glucose into the bloodstream and release the insulin from the pancreas when they sense glucose. And just because they industrialize sugar, let's not forget there's been lots of natural sugar. We make organic gur. The sugar cane was domesticated in India, in the Ganges basin. It's a lie that Columbus found it somewhere in the Pacific Islands. It's been used from the ancient texts. You can go back to the Jain text and the Buddhist text. And there's a lovely Jain temple where it's supposed to have been domesticated, where the prasad they give, prasad is the sacred food, a little bit of sugarcane juice. And we make gur, natural sugar, and shakar, and bura, and hundreds of ways of artisanal processing. And these are complex sugars. They don't contribute to diabetes. Ayurveda actually recommends them as part of a diabetic diet. We are just starting to figure out again, because it's not that systems like Ayurveda, which is the science of life, did not know, but we've forgotten. I mean, mechanistic thought and industrial farming has been nothing but a forgetting how life works and celebrating killing as a substitution for living. We need to get rid of that thinking, because it's given us a century of ecocide and genocide. The ecocide has exploded in the last 30 years as the industrial model has globalized. The genocide, which was so directly the objective of the original use of the chemicals in farming, which became chemicals of farming, the chemicals that were evolved, has again become a genocide. Whether it be the genocide of the farmers, the 310,000 farmers who committed suicide in India, the 200,000 farmers annually who die of pesticide poisoning. This is data according to the UN Rapporteur on Food. Or the sicknesses that are becoming the biggest killer, the chronic diseases. This is a genocide. It's nothing less than a genocide. And we have to stop both the ecocide and the genocide. And the ecocide and genocide will stop when we turn our backs to the mindset and the tools and the technologies that destroy life, to the intelligence and our capacities and our potential to regenerate life, protect life, and create life in abundance. We need to once again become conscious that food is living, and eating is not a mechanical act, but the most significant act for maintaining healthy lives and the life of the planet. Eating is a conversation between the soil, the plants, the cells in our gut, cells in our food, and between our gut and our brain. Eating is an intelligent act at the deepest cellular and microbial level, and I would say spiritual level too. Eating is an intelligent act. The cellular communication is the basis of health and well-being. It is also the root of disease. Poisoned food creates disease. We might be ignorant about the links between food and health, but our cells know. We can be fooled with fake labels, but we can't cheat our gut microbiome. And because food carries with it the memory of the biodiversity in soil and the plants, how food is grown is a major determinant of health. Through the ecological science of agroecology and Ayurveda, our minds could catch up with the intelligence of the earth, our bodies, its doshas, its cells, its microbes, which are trying to alert us to the dangers in our food and environment through the disease epidemic. It's time to regenerate. Thank you.